Okay, today's daf is Kuf Lamed Bet, and we are going to begin Kuf Lamed Aleph at the bottom. Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet at the bottom of the page, where it says Milah v'chol machshira dochin et Shabbat divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So this whole sugya, this whole piece of the past daf has been about various positive mitzvot, where Rabbi Eliezer says that not only does the mitzvah override Shabbat, but even preparations for the mitzvah will override Shabbat, and he applies this to almost every positive mitzvah one could think of. And goes through several examples, sukkah, shofar, etc., covering nearly the entire gamut of positive mitzvot in his discussion. So we come back though to the main subject of the perek, which is milah. Rabbi Eliezer says not only is the brit milah itself overriding Shabbat, but even machshira, which means even what you need to do in order to perform the mitzvah of Brit Milah, for example, sharpening the knife or even making a knife, whatever is necessary to accomplish the goal. So whereas everybody agrees that the performance of Brit Milah,
the tools on Shabbat for
so everybody agrees. So everybody agrees that the performance of Brit Milah overrides Shabbat. But Rabbi Eliezer's novelty is that he says even the preparations, in other words, it's the goal of the mitzvah that overrides Shabbat. So anything necessary to achieve the goal, even preliminaries, are going to override Shabbat, according to Rabbi Eliezer. So So the question is, where did Rabbi Eliezer get this position that all of the preparations for Brit Milah are likewise going to override Shabbat? So mikulu gamar keda amrinan. So if you're going to tell me that he learned from all of the previous examples, okay, because we had all of these other examples of cases of positive mitzvot that override Shabbat. So that won't work, because Keda Amrinan, we already said that there's something unique about all the other cases that justifies their overriding Shabbat, and we haven't seen what is unique about Brit Milah that it should override Shabbat. He had an example for Sukkah, for Shofar, from all of the other examples that were brought where he allows a mitzvah or the preparations for a mitzvah to override Shabbat. He had an explanation, he had a basis, but here we don't have a basis. Ve'od malahanach sheken imavar zimana batla. We turn to Kuf Lamed Bet Amud Aleph, and all other mitzvot also you have the mitigating factor that if you miss the mitzvah, you don't have a chance to make it up, it's over. But here, with Brit Milah, if you miss the day, what do? You just do it the next day. You can always do the Brit Milah. So why should it override Shabbat? And the answer is Eloheinu ta'amad Rabbi Eliezer. This is the reason of Rabbi Eliezer. Because the pasuk says Bayom Shemini Yimol B'Sar Orlato. It says Bayom Shemini, on the 8th day, Va'afilu b'Shabbat, which means even on Shabbat, the 8th day, no matter what. Could be Yom Kippur, could be Shabbat. So then we're going to turn it around, like they said for every other example on the previous daf. If we turn it around and say, okay, now that we know Brit Milah, why can't we just infer or derive all of the other examples? Why does Rabbi Eliezer have to justify each one of the examples where he gives a permission for Shabbat to be overridden? Why can't it all be derived from Brit Milah? The answer is because Mishum Dikala Mifrach Milah Sheken Nechretu Alea Shilosh Esrei Beritot. Milah is special because there were 13 covenants made with regard to Brit Milah, which means that the word Brit is mentioned 13 times in connection with circumcision. So therefore, because it's so fundamental, it's such an important mitzvah, maybe you'll say that's why Brit Milah and all of its preparations override Shabbat. But these other mitzvot like Sukkah, Lulav, Rosh Hashanah, with Avraham Avinu, So Rosh Hashanah, all of these other, Shofar, and all of these other commandments, the Omer, all of the examples that were given on the previous daf, you can't say that they have this great significance that Brit Milah has. Okay, so therefore you can't derive them from Brit Milah. Each one requires its own derivation. So now the Gemara says, Ad kan lo peligei Rabbanan ale ela b'machshirei milah. Aval mila gufa divrei hakol docha Shabbat. So minalan, the question is, everybody agrees, the machloket, the argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is in preparations. In other words, can you sharpen a knife on Shabbat for Brit Milah? Can you make a knife on Shabbat for Brit Milah? Can you transport a knife on Shabbat for Brit Milah? What can you do the preparations necessary for the Brit Milah? But everybody agrees that you can perform the Brit Milah. If all the preparations are done, both the Chachamim, the rabbis, and Rabbi Eliezer agree, obviously, that the actual Brit can be done. Nobody questions that. So, minalan, where do we get the idea that a Brit Milah can be performed on Shabbat? Forget about machshirim. Machshirim means what is necessary as a preliminary for the Brit Milah. What about the performance itself? Why does everybody agree on that? So, Amar Ula says halacha. It is a tradition, an oral tradition going back to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's just an axiom. It's a rule that one can perform Brit Milah on Shabbat. V'chein amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and similarly Rabbi Yitzchak said, halacha. It's a halacha, meaning it's a tradition, it's a halacha, an oral tradition going back to Moshe from Har Sinai, telling us that Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, which means to say we can't find any basis for it. You're not going to be able to find it in a pasuk, you're not going to find it in a verse, you're not going to be able to derive it from anywhere in the text. It's just a principle that we have handed down to us from Moshe Rabbeinu that you can do Brit Milah on Shabbat, period. Okay, so now the Gemara asks, wait a second, I'm going to raise an objection to that. Because minayin the pikuach nefesh shedochayet Shabbat, how do we know that saving a life overrides Shabbat? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah omer ma milah shehi achat me'evarav shel adam dochayet Shabbat, kal v'chomer lepikuach nefesh shedochayet Shabbat. Well, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, if for Brit Milah, which affects only one part of the body, you can override Shabbat, that's only taking care of one part of the body. So pikuach nefesh, that saves the entire person's life, certainly it should override Shabbat. What's more important, Brit Milah or saving a life? Obviously saving a life is more important. So if Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, certainly saving a life is going to override Shabbat, says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. But there's a problem. If you're going to tell me that the fact that a Brit Milah overrides Shabbat is a halacha, meaning it's just a tradition that we got from Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, then kal v'chomer me'halacha mi'ateh. Can we reason from a halacha, a kal v'chomer? In other words, what this means is, when we don't know the reason for a certain halacha, it's just a tradition. It's just a fact. We just accept it, like that you can do Brit Milah on Shabbat. You can't derive anything from that. You can't say, well, if Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, then therefore certainly saving a life overrides Shabbat. You can't reason anything from it. Why can't you reason anything from it? Because we don't really know why it is to begin with. If you don't know why something is, you just have it as a rule, you don't know the basis for the rule, so you can't use that rule really for anything else. You know that the rule is correct, but you can't infer anything else from the rule because you don't really know why the rule is true to begin with. Okay, so therefore what the Gemara is saying is that if we're going to say that Brit Milah is just a rule, that Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, then how can Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah derive an additional halacha from that rule? We don't know why the rule is. It could be that if we knew the reasoning behind the rule, we wouldn't be able to make this inference from it. We wouldn't be able to derive another halacha from it. So we don't know. So the Gemara, and how do we know that you can't derive any logical inference from a halacha? Because v'hatani will nidar braita amar lo Rabbi Elazar. This is a discussion actually from. This is the discussion of tumat met. It should be Rabbi Eliezer, not Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Eliezer said Akiva. So he's speaking to Rabbi Akiva and he says, Etzem kisora mitamei halacha, or Rabbi Dam kal v'chomer, ve'en danin kal v'chomer halacha. That Rabbi Eliezer had criticized the position of Rabbi Akiva, telling him, you can't learn a kal v'chomer, you can't make any reasoning, you can't derive any new principles from something which itself is a halacha, is a tradition handed down from Moshe Rabbeinu. Because we don't know why it is. And what was the argument there? They were talking about an issue of tum'ah of a nazir. If a nazir comes into contact with a dead body, then he has to shave his head and start counting nazirut all over again. Because a nazir is a person who made an oath that he's not going to cut his hair, and he's not going to drink wine, and he's also not allowed to become impure through contact with the dead. So if the nazir touches, let's say, the rule is that if the nazir touches a se'orah of bone, a se'orah is a barley corn size, a tiny amount of bone that will make him tameh. That will make him have to start his count over. So Rabbi Akiva said, I can give you a kal v'chomer, that if a tiny amount of a dead person's bone will make a Nazir have to start his count over again, then definitely a revi'it of blood from a dead person, a certain quantity of blood, should also make a Nazir tameh. Why? And he gives a reason, because he says, if you go into the same roof, you're under the same roof as a dead body, so you become tameh from being under the same roof. What if you're under the same roof as a tiny piece of bone from a dead body? That's not enough. That won't make you tameh. But what if you're under the same roof as a revi'it, let's say a couple of ounces of, or 3 ounces of blood of a dead body? You will become tameh. So he says, if we know as a halacha that a tiny amount of bone will make a Nazir tameh, then certainly blood should make a Nazir tameh. Blood from a dead body. Why? Because a tiny amount of bone can't make you tameh from being under the same roof as it with it, but blood can. So then if a tiny amount of bone can make a Nazir tameh, blood certainly can, because blood is obviously more stringent than bone. And Rabbi Eliezer said, no, that's not true. Why? You can't derive halachot, because the idea that a tiny amount of bone, that the barley corn size of bone makes the Nazir tameh, is a halacha. It's just a principle that we received from tradition. You can't get anything else out of it. You can't derive anything else about blood or about any other subject from that halacha. So, but the point is that when you have a tradition that comes down to you and you don't know the reason, you don't know the basis, it's just a tradition, we just know it to be true, you can't derive anything else from that. You can't make a kal v'chomer from that. And therefore you can't take Brit Milah and say, well, Brit Milah overriding Shabbat is just an axiom. We just have it as a tradition. It's what's called the halacha leMoshe miSinai, something told to Moshe at Sinai, at Har Sinai. You can't take that and say, well, therefore, pikuach nefesh, saving a life, should certainly override Shabbat. You can't say anything from the Brit Milah case because we don't know the reason for it. So then the Gemara says, rather, let's augment our position a little bit. Ela amar Rabbi Elazar atya ot. Rather, what we're going to say is that it's not a halacha. It's not just a principle that we received from Moshe Rabbeinu that was handed down, but we learn it from the word ot. It's just like Shabbat is called ot ki oti, right? Oti beini uvenechem. Okay, it's a sign between man and God. So too, ot with regard to Brit Milah, it's ot berit. It's a sign of the covenant, a sign of the Brit. So just like Brit Milah is called Ot and Shabbat is called Ot, that shows you that Brit Milah overrides Shabbat. Ela me'ataf, that's true. Tefillin dechtiv behen Ot l'tchi Shabbat. According to that, Tefillin should override Shabbat. It's also called Ukshartam le'ot. It's a sign. Now what does it mean Tefillin should override Shabbat? How is putting on Tefillin a violation of Shabbat? It's not. So the Rishonim, the commentaries say that it means making Tefillin. You should be able to make Tefillin on Shabbat because it's also called an Ot. If you're going to tell me that anything called an Ot overrides Shabbat, Tefillin should also. Okay, so the Gemara says, you're right. Ela atya brit brit. You know what? Shabbat is called a Brit. Okay? It's called a Brit. A covenant that we have with Hashem. And Brit and Milah, circumcision, is also called a Brit. It's also called a Lidorotam Berit Olam. Okay, we say that it's a covenant. So since Brit Milah, since circumcision is called Brit and Shabbat is called Brit, that means that circumcision overrides Shabbat. So then the Gemara says, wait a second. But Gadol dichtiv beberit lirche Shabbat. According to that, then even someone who is an adult getting a Brit Milah should override Shabbat. Because all we know is that a child whose 8th day falls out on Shabbat is allowed to get their Brit Milah on Shabbat, correct? But if, let's say, the baby delayed the Brit because it had jaundice or something, you can't do it on Shabbat now. You can't do it on Shabbat just because that's the earliest day. You have to wait till Sunday. So it's not true. A gadol here doesn't necessarily mean an adult. It means anybody past the 8th day. Also, it's called brit, so that should override Shabbat as well. Ela atya dorot dorot. Rather, because it says dorot, it says generations. It says generations with regard to the brit milah of a child on its 8th day, and it says dorot, generations, with regard to Shabbat. Ledorotam berit olam. Right? The Dorotam, so for all generations. So Brit Milah of a child on the 8th day should override Shabbat. So the Gemara says, no, tzitzit echtiv beidorot l'ilchei Shabbat. According to that, you should be able to tie tzitzit on Shabbat. Because it says, you should make tzitzit al kanfei vigdehem l'dorotam. Also, Right? So that means what? That you should be able to tie tzitzit if that's the derivation. So El Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak danin ot berit v'dorot me'ot berit v'dorot la'apokei hanach dechad chadhu dechtiv bahen. So what does Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak say? He says, I'm going to take all of these derivations and I'm going to say there are only two things that have all three of these terms in common: covenant, brit, sign, ot, and dorot, generations. What are the only two things that have all three of these terms associated with them? Circumcision has ot, brit, and dorot. Shabbat has ot, brit, and dorot. All the others just have one or the other, but not all three. So you see that the importance of Brit Milah is equated in a certain way with Shabbat, because they have the same three terms describing them, and that's why Brit Milah should override Shabbat only for an 8-day-old baby. That's how Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak works it out. For Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, much simpler. We don't have to go that far at all. Amar Kra, the pasuk says Bayom. It says Bayom Hashemini, on the 8th day. What does Bayom mean? Bayom afilu b'Shabbat. That Bayom on that day means even on Shabbat, no matter what. So Amar Lei said to him, Amar Lei Resh Lakish, Rabbi Yochanan. Resh Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, Ela me'ata, according to you, mechusre kapara, tichtiv baho bayom, achinami didahu Shabbat. According to you, when a person is tamei and somebody is called a mechusre kapara, there are certain types of impurity a person can have where they have to wait a certain amount of time. Let's say a man has what's called is a zav. A zav is a person who has to wait 7 clean days, that he has a certain emission from his genital area. So he has to wait 7 clean days where he has no emission, and then he has to go to immerse in mayim chayim, in a stream, and then he has to bring a korban. So once he has immersed, all he has left is to bring a korban. That's called mechusre kapara. All that's missing is his kapara. Once he brings the korban, now we can go back into the Beit HaMikdash. So his purification will be complete. It's called mechusre kapara. So he says, it also says there, bayom hashemini. On the 8th day, he should bring his korban. So according to you, that bayom hashemini and Brit Milah means that you can do it on Shabbat. Can this person who wants to finish their purification process do it on Shabbat? No, because it's not necessary to do it on Shabbat. He will wait till Sunday. But according to you, bayom means he can do it. No. He says, "How mi ba'ele bayom velo balayla?" No, because the bayom hashemini for the zav is to teach you bayom velo balayla. That any korban he brings, in other words, that zav who had to wait 7 days and then he immerses on the 7th day, he's going to bring his korban on the 8th day, right? What about night? Why can't he just wait till the 7th day is over and bring the korban at night as soon as the 7th day is over? Why does he have to wait till the next day? You might think he could do it right away. So that's why it says bayom velo balayla. But that bayom is not teaching you that he can do it on Shabbat. The Gemara says, he says that still, but we need the same thing for Brit Milah. Isn't Brit Milah also only during the day? You never saw Brit Milah at night, did you? Has to be during the day. So why don't you say the same thing about Brit Milah? Bayom hashemini means it has to be daytime, not nighttime. So it says, no, mi ben shimonat yamim nafka. We know that from mi ben shimonat yamim. We have more than one verse. It says when he's 8 days old, meaning yamim, it says, meaning daytime. Hainami mi bayom tzavoto nafka. So he says, so the Gemara says, well, I can do the same thing with you with regard to the person who's bringing their korban. In other words, the question here is, we have two situations where it says bayom hashemini. One is the person who's bringing his atonement, finishing his purification. The other one is the Brit Milah. If one of them can be done on Shabbat, why can't the other one be done on Shabbat? The same exact language is used, bayom. So you said, well, bayom means bayom velo balayla, daytime, not nighttime. Well, I showed you, well, Brit Milah also it says bayom velo balayla. And you told me, well, there are 2 verses that say daytime. One of them is to teach you daytime, the other one is to teach you even on Shabbat. But with the purification, it's only 1 verse. He says, no, there's also a verse for purification. There's one that says bayom tzavoto, that all korbanot can only be brought during the day. So you have 2 verses. One is for the purification, and that it has to be on the 8th day and not the night. There are actually 2 verses, so why can't the second verse mean even on Shabbat? So the Gemara says no, because Afal gav denafka mi bayom tavato itzricha salka datach mina hoel v'chas rachman alei latuge bedalut balayla nami letek kamashmalan. So he answers and says like this: that when it comes to the mechusrei kapara, when it comes to the person who's bringing his purification, you might have thought it would be an exception to the rule. That's why you needed to mention it twice. You need to mention twice, because if you mentioned it only once, you might have thought that we would make an exception. Why would you make an exception? Because we make a lot of exceptions for the person who's coming to purify themselves. In particular, we allow them, if they can't afford to bring the regular korban, we let them bring a more affordable korban. So maybe you would have said, maybe we'll let him do it at night also. Maybe he has to work during the day or something. We'll let him do it at night. It'll be easier for him. So, since we bend the rules in some ways, you might bend the rules in this way. So that's why it has to say, it has to emphasize, with regard to the mechusrei kapara, that this can only be done during the day. The general rule, you might have thought, wouldn't apply. Okay, that's why you need that. But it's not to tell you that it can be done on Shabbat, only to tell you that it must be done during the day. So then, matkifla ravina elamayata yehe zar kasher ben vehe onen kasher ben. But then maybe you'll think, according to you, how do we know that somebody who's bringing their korban to purify themselves can't have a non-Kohen officiate? Or an onen officiate. An onen is somebody who lost a relative that day. The relative passed away that day. He's not allowed to officiate. An ordinary Kohen cannot be makriv onen. He can't bring a korban on the day that a close relative died. Maybe we should bend the rules for him too. Since you're saying bending the rules, where's your verse to show me that I don't bend the rules in other ways? You're telling me I need a verse to show me that we're not going to bend the rules and let this guy bring his korban at night. So how do I know that I don't bend the rules in other ways? Why aren't there other verses to show that I don't bend the rules for who officiates at the korban? Or who, under what conditions? So what's the answer? The answer is no, that's not a problem, because the Gemara answers, Hadrei kira. Once the pasuk tells you that we treat this korban in the normal way, that's all you need to know. In other words, you might have thought that the mechusrei kapara, the person who's bringing their atonement in order to become purified, that person would bend the rule that they could do it at night. And then maybe if they could do it at night, you would think there were other leniencies as well. So the Gemara is saying we only need one pasuk. Once the pasuk tells you it must be done during the day, that means it's the same as all other korbanot. So in all other respects, it's also the same as all other korbanot. But there's no verse to show you that you could ever bring this sacrifice on Shabbat. So the Brit Milah that has two mentions of the word Yom, that you can do even on Shabbat. But this korban cannot be brought on Shabbat. So now the Gemara says, Rav Achabar Yaakov Amar Kara Shemini afilu b'Shabbat. That according to Rav Achabar Yaakov, the word Shemini is the decisive word. It says eighth. Eighth means even if it's on Shabbat. So Bayom, according to Rabbi Achabar Yaakov, Bayom is definitely means the daytime. That's what Rav Achabar Yaakov is saying. Shemini tells you even on Shabbat. Hi Shemini mi ba'ile lema'utei shvi'i. Why does Rav Achabar Yaakov tell me that Shemini, the word eighth, means even on Shabbat? How do I know that it can't be on the seventh day? I need the word Shemini. It's not to tell me anything about Shabbat. Answer mi ben shemonat yamim nafka. We know that because it says he has to be 8 days old. We have two verses. Verse number 1 is he has to be 8 days old. Verse number 2 is Shemini afilu b'Shabbat. Even if the 8th day falls out on Shabbat. So then the Gemara asks, wait a second. Maybe if I just had the words mi ben shimonat yamim, that when he's 8 days old he can do a brit milah, maybe I would think 8 days and up. So 10 days is fine, 11 days is fine. In other words, that's just a minimum. How do I know it has to be the 8th day? I need Shemini to tell me the 8th day. Not just anything past day 8. So because if I only had mi ben shimonat yamim, I would say to myself, a minimum is 8 days old. But once he's 8 days old, anything older is fine. Okay, because under 8 days is not old enough. The obligation didn't come yet. Once the obligation came, it could be any day after that. So that's why I need Shemini. That's why Rav Achabar Yaakov is not a convincing interpretation. The word Shemini is necessary to tell you specifically the 8th day. Not just after the 8th day, anytime after the 8th day, but specifically the 8th day. And so therefore, really we go with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Bayom HaShemini means it must be the 8th day, even if it's Shabbat. Tanya, Kivatid Rabbi Yochanan Zudlak Rav Acha bar Yaakov. There was a Braita that supports Rabbi Yochanan's view and not Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Shemini Yimol Afilu B'Shabbat, because it says on the 8th day you have to do the Brit Milah, even if it's Shabbat. Oma ani mekayem mechalelei amot yumat. But wait a second. Doesn't it say that somebody who desecrates Shabbat will get the death penalty? Mechalelei amot yumat. You can't do malacha on Shabbat. And cutting, drawing blood, it's malacha. It's a violation of Shabbat. So how could it be? Bishar melachot chutz mimilah. That's all other melachot except for Brit Milah. It's an exception. Wait a second. Maybe you'll tell me that really it's not allowed to be done on Shabbat. Maybe when it says don't do any melachot means even Brit Milah you're not allowed to do. Talmud lomar bayom afilu b'Shabbat. That's why it says bayom, on that day, even if it's Shabbat. Amar Rava says haytana meikara maika nichale ulevasof maika kashele. So it's very interesting. They interpret the Braita as actually going through a thought process. Okay, the thought process is because first the Braita said that Brit Milah overrides Shabbat. Then it said, oh, maybe it doesn't. No, and then in the end it says it does. Right. So the question is, what were the two possibilities that were being entertained? Right? What were the two possibilities for whether it should or not? So the Gemara answers. Rava is explaining here. So Hakika Amar Shemini Yimol Afilu B'Shabbat Ma'ani Mekei Mechalei Amot Yumat B'Shar Melachot Chutz Mimilah V'Al Milah Dachya Mai Ta'ama. So in other words, what was the Braita started out by saying Brit Milah should override Shabbat. Then it said maybe it shouldn't. So what's the argument to defend each? Okay, so what defends the argument that really Brit Milah should override Shabbat? Because kal v'chomer, it's a kal v'chomer. Umat tzaraat shedocha et ha'avodah. Tzaraat overrides the service in the temple. Why does it override the service in the temple? Because if somebody has tzaraat, they have this leprosy on their skin, they can't serve in the temple. And even if all the kohanim had it, they're not allowed to remove their tzaraat. They can't go to the dermatologist or the plastic surgeon, and cut it off. They're not allowed to, even though that means the service won't be done. So what overrides? Tzaraat actually overrides the service. However, and va'avodah docha et Shabbat, and the service in the temple overrides Shabbat, because even though slaughtering and cooking are prohibited on Shabbat, don't you do that for the korbanot? You slaughter the animals, you put them on the mizbech, you cook them. So tzaraat overrides the service in the temple. Because if you have tzaraat, you can't remove it, even though that means the service in the temple won't be done. And the service in the temple is greater than Shabbat, because the service in the temple overrides Shabbat. Okay? But milah docha, so if that's the case, milah docha ota Shabbat shenidchet mipnei avodah, eno din shetei milah docha ota. Okay? So milah it overrides actually tzaraat. Why? Because let's say a baby has tzaraat on the area of the milah, where the Brit Milah has to be done, the circumcision area. Even though normally you're not allowed to cut off tzaraat, if you're doing the mitzvah of Brit Milah, you can do it. So what do you see? Brit Milah overrides tzaraat, because you're allowed to cut off tzaraat even though, when you're doing the mitzvah of Brit Milah. But tzaraat, the prohibition of cutting off tzaraat overrides the service in the temple, because normally you wouldn't be allowed to cut it off in order to do the service of the temple. And the service in the temple overrides Shabbat, because the service of the temple is done on Shabbat. So what does that mean? Brit Milah overrides Shabbat. Because Brit Milah is more important than tzaraat, tzaraat is more important than the avodah is more important than Shabbat. So Brit Milah is the most important. It should override Shabbat. There you go. So now the Gemara says, wait a second. So what was the other possibility that the Braita was entertaining, that Brit Milah wouldn't override Shabbat? Because Hadar Amar Omimai de Tzarat Chamura. Because you could argue the opposite, that really tzaraat is not more stringent than the service in the temple. Why? Because Dilma Shabbat Chamura Sheken Yesh Ba'onashin V'Asarot Harbe. Really, Shabbat is more important than tzaraat. And even though Brit Milah overrides tzaraat, Brit Milah you're allowed to cut off the leprosy, even though when you do the Brit Milah. But that doesn't mean you can override Shabbat. Omimai Mishum Dechamirat Tzarati Dilma Mishum Garvahu Delo Chazeh Omani Mekayem Shemini Mol Chutz Mi Shabbat. Because I could argue like this: it's not that tzaraat is greater than the service in the temple and is greater than Shabbat. It's really not. Brit Milah can override tzara'at, not because tzara'at is greater than. It's not because tzara'at is greater than Shabbat. Brit Milah overrides tzara'at, but it couldn't override Shabbat because it's not that tzara'at is greater than the temple service. In other words, we're assuming like this: tzara'at, leprosy, is greater than the temple service. Because why? Because if you have tzara'at, you can't serve in the temple, and you're not allowed to remove the tzara'at. But maybe it's not that tzara'at is more significant. It's not that it's greater than the temple service. It's just that the person, when he has tzara'at, is unfit to serve. He's just unfit to serve. It's not overriding the temple service. It's not greater than the temple service. It's just that when you have tzara'at, you're unfit to serve, and you're not allowed to remove it by cutting it. Okay? So really Shabbat is more important. And just because circumcision overrides tzara'at doesn't mean that circumcision would override Shabbat. Therefore the Gemara has to say, or the Braita had to say, so therefore Talmud Lomar bayom afilu b'Shabbat. That's why we have to learn that Bayom means even on Shabbat, that there's a special dispensation to do Brit Milah on Shabbat. Now the rabbis say, Tanu Rabbanan, Milah docha et tzara'at ben bizmana ben shelo bizmana. When we say that Brit Milah overrides tzara'at, that if a person had leprosy on their area of the circumcision, that the circumcision overrides the prohibition of removing tzara'at, even if the Brit Milah is not being done at its proper time, meaning even if an adult comes and wants to do Brit Milah, but he has tzara'at all over his body, he's allowed to do it, even though he's going to remove tzara'at by doing it. However, b'yom tov ena docha ela bizmana bilvad. However, let's say a Brit Milah was pushed off, and now it's Yom Tov, it's Rosh Hashanah, it's Pesach, it's not Shabbat. There, you're not allowed to do the Brit Milah unless the 8th day is Yom Tov. But if it was delayed, if the Brit Milah was delayed, you can't do it on Yom Tov. Okay, so where do we get this from? The Tan Rabbanan, as the Rabbi taught, Himol B'sar Orlato Va'afal Pi Shesham Baheret Yakotz, that it says you have to circumcise the flesh of the foreskin, even if there's Baheret there, even if there is Tzara'at, there's leprosy there, Yakotz, he has to cut it. Okay, and what about the pasuk that says guard the nega hatzarat? You're not allowed to cut off. You're not allowed to cut tzara'at off of your body. That means except for Brit Milah. Brit Milah is an exception. Maybe you'll argue that really tzara'at cannot be cut off anytime. And even if you had tzara'at on the place of the Brit Milah, you wouldn't be allowed to circumcise. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says basar va'afal pi shesham baheret. That's why the extra word of basar, bisar or lato, okay, comes to teach you that even if there is leprosy there, you're allowed to cut it. So now the Gemara asks exactly the same question that it did before. Amar Rava says, what was the reasoning process here? First we assumed that tzara'at should be overridden by Brit Milah, then we're retracting and saying it should not, and then we're saying it should. So Hakikamar, this is what it is. So what was the original thought of Milah dochat tzara'at? What was the original thought? That Brit Milah should override leprosy. Again, we're going to say a kal v'chomer. We're going to make a logical equation here. If Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, even though Shabbat is very holy, Milah will override Shabbat. Tzara'at lo kol sheken. So shouldn't it surely override the prohibition of removing tzara'at? The prohibition of removing tzara'at is not as big of a deal as Shabbat. So then why did the Braita question whether Brit Milah should override tzara'at? What was the thought the other way? Hadar ka'amar mimai di Shabbat chamira dilma tzara'at chamira shekin dochat avodah v'avodah dochat Shabbat. Maybe we'll go back to what we said before. Tzara'at is more important than Shabbat. It's more powerful than Shabbat. How so? Because the temple service overrides Shabbat. We sacrifice animals on Shabbat. We cook the animals on Shabbat. But tzara'at, leprosy, overrides the temple service, because if a person has leprosy, they cannot cut it off in order to serve in the temple. So maybe you'll think tzara'at is of greater significance than Brit Milah, because it's of greater significance than Shabbat. So maybe Brit Milah shouldn't override it. So Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, Basar v'afal pi sheisham baheret. That's why we need a special pasuk to teach us that Brit Milah overrides tzara'at. Lishana achari. Now we have an alternative version of this discussion. Milah dochat tzara'at ma'itama date aseh v'dache lo ta'aseh. So that first, the Gemara, so that this is a different interpretation. Not that we made an equation between Shabbat and tzara'at, but a different view. That why did the Baraita originally think that Brit Milah should override tzara'at? Because usually a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment. Umay o eno dekamar hadar kamar emadam rinandate asev dachayet lo tase greda hay asev lo tasehu. That normally, when do we say a positive commandment overrides a negative commandment? Only when the positive, it's an equation. In other words, one positive against one negative. But when you have one positive up against a positive and a negative, then the one positive is not going to override. Okay? So for example, Shabbat is a positive and a negative. Rest on Shabbat, don't do malacha on Shabbat. There are many commandments where the negative is also a positive. So there, we don't use the rule a positive overrides a negative, because the positive is overriding a positive and a negative. And in tzara'at we say that really, there's a negative commandment, don't cut off the tzara'at, and there's a positive commandment to guard the tzara'at when you have it. So you can't say Brit Milah is going to override it, because you're overriding a positive and a negative. Okay? So Talmud Omar, Besar v'afbishisham baheret. So what does the Gemara conclude? The Gemara concludes that the Baraita's reasoning is that that's why we need a pasuk. Because if we use logic alone, we might be able to go one way or the other way. So we need a pasuk to teach us definitively that Brit Milah overrides tzara'at. So now the Gemara says, wait a second. That makes sense. Tenach gadol dechtiv b'hu basar. In the pasuk that speaks about an adult having brit milah, it uses the word basar. Katan nami ketiv be basar. And with a child, it also says basar. In other words, on the 8th day, it says the word basar. When it talks about a fully grown adult, okay, meaning when the adult is independent, it also says the word basar. Okay, in other words, somebody who's responsible for their own brit milah, it says basar. And a baby on the 8th day, it says basar. But benoni minalan, what about a child who's past 8 days old but is not yet bar mitzvah? How do we know that his brit milah can override tzara'at? Amar Abaye says atya mi benaya, that it comes from in between. Because why? Migadol lo atya sheken anosh karet, mikatan lo atya sheken milah bizmana, hatzad hashaveh shebehen, sheken nimolin v'dochin et hatzarat, af kol shenimolin dochin et hatzarat. Abaye says it's very simple. Because a baby, in other words, we have two examples. Whenever you have two examples, you try to figure out, is there a common denominator? And then if I know the common denominator, I can apply it beyond the two examples, right? So example number one is the baby getting circumcised on the 8th day. He is getting circumcised on the correct day. An adult has has the dispensation, so the baby is allowed to have brit milah done even if it's going to remove tzara'at. Maybe you'll say the reason is, well, because that's special, because that's being done on the actual day itself, the 8th day. Maybe for anybody else, we have to wait for it to clear up. And if I told you that a 13-year-old could override tzara'at by doing brit milah, that's because he's responsible for the mitzvah, and it's a very severe mitzvah. Okay? But in between, maybe you would say no. But now that I have two examples, I have the example of the baby being circumcised on the proper day, and I have the example of the 13-year-old getting circumcised, where he's personally responsible. And I see that in both cases, it overrides tzara'at. In both cases, it overrides leprosy. That means it's not just because it's a baby being circumcised on the right day. And it's not just because it's somebody who's responsible for their own consequences. Okay, neither of those two factors are the reason. The fact is, any brit milah overrides tzara'at. Because with those two examples, the only common denominator they have is they're both brit milah and they override tzara'at. So even though the person had leprosy in the place of the brit milah, it would be overridden by the brit milah. Rava says, Milah bizmana docha, lo tzrichakra, mikal v'chomer atya. I don't need to know that brit milah overrides tzara'at when it's being done on the proper day. Why not? Because it comes from Kavach Ramash about the Chamirad Chatzarat Lo Kol Sheken. Because if I know that I can override Shabbat, in other words, if the 8th day of the baby falls out on Shabbat, I know I can override Shabbat by doing Brit Milah. Certainly I can override Tzarat. Amar le Rav Safra le Rava. Rav Safra said to Rava, Mimai di Shabbat Chamirad Dilma Tzarat Chamirash Ken Dochat Avodah Vavodah Dochat Shabbat. He said, how do you know that Shabbat is more stringent than Tzara'at? How do you know that just because Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, therefore Brit Milah overrides Tzara'at? How do you know? He says, you could argue the other way. You could say that Tzara'at actually is more stringent than Shabbat, like we said before, because Tzara'at actually can interfere with the temple service. And the temple service overrides Shabbat. So maybe Tzara'at is greater than Shabbat. So he says, no, hatam lav mishum de chamirat tzaraat elam mishum de gavrat hu de lo chazeh. It's not that tzaraat is greater than the temple service. It's that tzaraat, Rava says, is just that the person's not fit to serve. It's not that tzaraat is greater. But in the mitzvah itself, in terms of significance, obviously, Shabbat is more significant than tzaraat, period. And therefore, if Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, then Brit Milah certainly overrides tzaraat. And so then it says, so then why can't he just cut off the tzarat and serve in the temple? According to you, it's no big deal. So it's no big deal to cut off the it should be that avodah is more important, because we know avodah is more important than Shabbat, because the temple service overrides Shabbat. And you're telling me that really tzarat is not as important as Shabbat. It's less important than Shabbat. So why can't you just take off the leprosy, cut it off, and go serve in the temple? The answer is mechusar tevilahu. He still has to go to the mikveh. That's why. So it won't help him. It won't help him. So but tenach negaim tameim negaim taorim ma'ikal memar. What if the person has tzaraat that doesn't make him tameh? Sometimes a person can have white. Their entire body is covered in white. He's not tameh. However, he can't serve in the temple because he has what's called a mum. He has a blemish. He looks strange. So why can't he go to the plastic surgeon, dermatologist, get it removed, and then he can serve in the temple? He won't have to go to the mikveh because he wasn't tameh, but he would be violating the prohibition of removing the tzara'at, but he's doing it to serve in the temple. It should be allowed. Ela Amar Ravashi, rather Ravashi says, Echad Amrinan Datease V'dachai Lo Taase Kigon Mila B'tzarat Ina Mitzitzit V'kilayim Tebeidna Demitaker Lav Kamokem Aseh Demitaker Lav Kamokim Aseh Hachabidna Demitaker Lelav Lo Kamokim Aseh. What's the real reason why you can't remove tzara'at to serve in the temple? Ravashi says it's very simple. Because you're thinking in terms of what's more important. Oh, the service in the temple is more important than tzara'at. That's true. But the only time we say one thing is going to override the other thing is when it's simultaneous. At the moment you're doing the positive mitzvah, you're also violating the negative. So when you violate Shabbat and when you do the Brit Milah, it's happening simultaneously. You're doing the cutting. The cutting and the fulfillment of the mitzvah and the violation of Shabbat are happening at the same moment. When you wear kilayim b'tzitzit, you have tzitzit that are also made of wool and linen. At the moment that you're fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzit, you're also violating the commandment of wearing wool and linen together. It's okay, because if you're wearing a linen garment with the wool techelet on it, it's allowed because the positive mitzvah of wearing tzitzit overrides the negative. But that's only because at the very moment you're fulfilling the positive, you're overriding the negative. But here, what are you saying? Remove the tzara'at from your body and then go in to do the temple service. It's not that at the moment you're doing the temple service, you're violating the prohibition of removing the tzara'at. You're doing the removal beforehand. You're violating the prohibition beforehand. That you can't do. Just like you wouldn't be able to remove the tzara'at and then later do the Brit Milah. It's only when doing the Brit Milah is removing the tzara'at at the same time. Okay, that's when one overrides the other one. So now the Gemara says, V'hadir Rava v'Rav Safra Tanaihi. Actually, the argument between Rava and Rav Safra is a machloket Tanaim as we move to Kuf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph. The Tanya, as we said in the Braita, Basar v'afal pi sheisham baheret imol divrei Rabbi Yoshaya. Rabbi Yonatan Omer, that basically there's a machloket in the Braita. One view says that tzara'at actually requires a special pasuk to tell us. that doing Brit Milah, when you simultaneously override the prohibition of removing the tzara'at, that you require a verse for that, because actually you might have thought that even though Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, you might have thought it wouldn't override the prohibition of removing tzara'at from the body. So therefore Rabbi Yoshaya says that you need a pasuk to tell you. And however, Rabbi Yonatan says you don't need a pasuk, because since Brit Milah overrides Shabbat, it definitely is going to override tzara'at. So you see that they're arguing about the same point, whether tzara'at is equal or greater than Shabbat, and therefore just because I can override Shabbat doesn't mean I can override tzara'at, and I need a special pasuk to tell me. Or is it that if it overrides Shabbat, then it certainly will also override tzara'at, and therefore I don't need a special pasuk to tell me that Brit Milah will override Shabbat. Now the significance here is that according to, we had a question, okay, we know that a baby who's being circumcised on the proper day, you can override tzara'at. And we know that an adult you can override tzara'at from the word basar also. How do you know in between? How do you know in between is also allowed? So Abaye said we make an equation and we say, well, the common denominator between the two cases is that it's Brit Milah and it overrides tzara'at. Rava says that's not true. You don't need that. Because since you don't need a verse to tell you that circumcision on the 8th day overrides tzara'at, because since it's overriding Shabbat, it certainly will override tzara'at. Therefore you can use that pasuk to tell you that even after the 8th day, any circumcision will override the prohibition of tzara'at. You don't need the pasuk to tell you about the 8th day, because the 8th day is already obvious. Since the 8th day, even Shabbat would be overridden. So here we have a question about, the general question is, how do we measure, or how do we make a hierarchy of the importance of various mitzvot, or the importance of various prohibitions, and in what context is it made? And you see different ways of approaching it, and how when we use logical reasoning to try to make these equations, it can become very complicated, because we can find stringencies in one that don't exist in the other.